Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. My name is Gavin Browning. I'm the Director of Events and Public Programs here at GSAPP. And welcome back to another season of events here in Wood Auditorium. If you haven't already, I hope you'll pick up a calendar. This is our spring program and there's a lot of great things around the corner starting tonight. And I'm really excited for tonight's talk on stress after Sandy. I'd like to thank Hilary for organizing this event. She's an associate professor of architecture here at GSAPP, where she also directs the Core 3 housing studio and runs studios and seminars on health and architecture. She's also a founder and principal, as I'm sure a lot of you know, of the New York firm Moss with Michael Meredith. And she will be introducing our speakers tonight. We'll hear from a few people and then have a group conversation. So please welcome Hilary Sample.
Thank you, Gavin, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm excited to kick off the lecture series for the spring with tonight's conversation. I'd like to think of it more as a kind of informal and maybe prodding talk amongst the speakers. I want to also just thank the Mailman School of Public Health for co-sponsoring the lecture tonight. It's great to try to bridge between the two schools, particularly in this subject. For me, I was interested in trying to bring together a group of scholars and thinkers, architects, artists, and urban design component to talk about sort of what we called house, but also stress after Sandy, and to try to, I think, hopefully maybe frame a conversation around these issues that are really about compounding problems and how architecture, in thinking about rebuilding, how we can also think and talk about issues of wellness and stress that maybe have yet to be touched upon in favor of this public conversation that's really gone on mostly about rebuilding, but to expand that and to, I think, open it up, I hope, to maybe some other terms, and to really think also about issues of representation. I think we talk so much about codes and guidelines and rules, and we've seen, I'd say, a lot of interesting projects over the last few years, different things from, let's say, a book like Grand Urban Rules, and then starting to look at other people's work like Christian Knoll's emotional mapping, where he actually sends people out into the city to map their stress around the city. So how do these things start to become graphic devices for practice and for also study? To that end, I wanted to just give a quick note and mention of another project that's ongoing here at GSAPP. Oh, if it will open, sorry. Too many windows here. Which is Laura Kurgan is working on and leading up a team on Superstorm Sandy and mapping this recent events from this, and you can find that at this link, which I can give to anyone after tonight's talk. So with that, I wanted to introduce the lecturers. So tonight we're going to have Professor Richard Plunz, who's director of the Urban Design Program since 1992. In 2005, Professor Plunz was appointed director of the Urban Design Lab at Columbia's Earth Institute. He has done research into the evolution of housing in New York City, which has led to a number of projects, including his well-known, and I use it in my housing studio, of course, History of Housing in New York City, as well as author of many other publications and books, including The Urban Life World, Formation, Perception, and Representation, After Shopping, Eco-Gowanus, Urban Remediation by Design, and his another most recent book, Urban Climate Change Crossroads, in 2010. I'm just going to introduce all the speakers right now, and then we will just, after the presentations, we'll meet around the table. Second presentation will be by Dr. Mindy Fullilove. She's a professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health and is public director of the American Institute of Architects. She has conducted research on AIDS and other epidemics with a special interest in the relationship between the collapse of communities and decline in public health. Her books include Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America, and What We Can Do About It, and The House of Joshua, Mediations on Family in Place. Our final speaker this evening is Damon Rich, who is an urban designer for the city of Newark, where he leads design efforts with public and private actors to improve the city's public spaces. Damon is a designer, artist, and founder of the Center for Urban Pedagogy. His work has been published and exhibited in many places. One of his projects that I like quite a lot, his exhibition Red Lines Housing Crisis Learning Center, was on display at the Queens Museum of Art in 2009. So I'd like to welcome Professor Plunz to the podium.
I didn't know I was going to be first, but we'll do our best to throw out some prods, you said, right? So bear with me. Anyway, it's great to be here with Damon and Mindy. Mindy and we did a studio together about 5 years ago. It's very interesting, Climb Studio. Damon, of course, is well known for all his great work with Cup, and still Cup, right? He's still involved with Cup, yeah. But Newark branch or something like that. Anyway, this is not mine. So, oh, do I have to do this? Where's my... That's somebody else's. Yes. Long version, GSAPP. You get the long version. That's the end of the long version. There. Let's start with W.G. Sebald. You can kind of read through this while I say a couple things. Especially the last little stanza there. I think it's a, really, really desperate topic. And it's interesting to see people here that are interested in the topic. I mean, cities, climate change. I mean, if after Sandy finally there isn't some kind of realization of the importance, then I don't know what it would take, but it will probably take one or two more, realistically, politically, but we'll see. W.G. Sebald, yeah, he wrote Austerlitz, he died about 10 years ago. Very interesting writer, Holocaust survivor. So he came to New York visiting in October 2000, I think. Yes, there was the big heat wave. And this was a very interesting observation which struck me. And here we get to one point I'd like to make, which is we're talking now about moving from the hard science to the soft science. We're talking about social science, and social science takes many forms, and of course a lot of my experience in the last 6 or 7 years has been on working with the hard science side with all of its limitations. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how that's really got to be expanded, and make a few points about it, and we can discuss it later. We really have 60 years of stress. I'm going to just run through some. Well, anyway, here's October 2012, 12 years later from Sebald's heat wave. By now, maybe October shouldn't be so surprising, but they continue to be. This is not very clear. It's an amazing map from the Times. Only about 3 weeks or so later, with a lot of layers, and probably you're going to incorporate this into your, you'll have something much more detailed at some point. But I would say that, yeah, this did influence the election in many ways. The first depiction, and you see the extent of simply, well, this storm, the science side doesn't agree whether it was really a tropical storm or Category 1, but it was somewhere in between. On the science side, you hear loose discussion about this could happen every 5 years. And I tend to hear loose discussion, around. So the big point is it's not just about hurricanes, it's not about heat waves, it's about something much more basic. And I think you can really go back well over half a century. I mean, there are no surprises. There's not even any surprises on the soft side, actually. It's just harder to enunciate. We have, at the beginning of the 60s, of course, we have the reaction to American consumer culture, studies like Community and Privacy, where you have Shermai, I remember, because I was a student, saying, well, does it really make sense to use 5,000 pounds of Detroit iron to go and pick up a 16-ounce box of cornflakes? Of course it doesn't. Or Ezra Mishan, the famous British economist who basically argued very effectively, in fact he did the mathematical model, that the automobile culture could not be reversed on its own beyond a certain moment. It's basically irreversible without extreme external intervention, which could be climate, of course. And they knew it would be climate. The limits to growth, which came out of the Club of Rome, of course, made predictions which are really right on target. CO2 concentrations, the curve compares their prediction with what's actually happened, and then you see a whole series of other socially, let's say, lifestyle-oriented projections in, of course, the curves in the middle there, in the toned area, are very close to reality. So this, for me, is when the stress starts. The stress in the system, and of course the stress, the social stress. So these are just, I'm throwing out your, your little probes, let's say. We have, of course, the culture, a problem with accepting any of this. The Economist magazine, this was, when was this? Economist was 2008, yes. It's just, nostalgic projections from '68 and when are we going to get over it kind of thing. And I think that thread still runs through, of course, the culture. And of course is in direct conflict with other points of view and other politics. You see, since the Club of Rome projections, what's happened to automobile use in the U.S., which is probably tripled, I don't know exactly, from 20 to 40, doubled at least. And then, of course, you see the multiplier effect with other, especially now with globalization, economic and cultural globalization, and the fact that, for instance, China is now outdoing us, but with our being only a fraction of the eventual population. So it's not, it's just not a pretty picture. There are studies, there are many studies. There was, I guess it was Columbia Magazine came out in the last 2 weeks. They had a whole listing of studies for New York City around climate change. And this is all, of course, predictive. This is the hard science side, more or less, although the hard science is moving more and more in the direction of understanding that they're not alone. In fact, they're a very small piece of the equation in terms of response. For our part, yes, we did a conference in Rome. I think it was 2008. Yes. Published 2010. I think it was 2008. In which was really the first conference that I know of that seriously tried to integrate the soft and hard science sides. It was very interesting. I'm not sure that it made much difference to publish this book. Some difference, of course. And I'm not sure how easy it would be to do another one. There hasn't been another one that I know of. One side note that has to do with the hard science side. You see on the left, that's the Rhone Glacier, which feeds Lake Geneva. So the basic question on the science side is, do you move Geneva to another lake? or what? You know, how is this deeply embedded culture in this place connected to the spatial geography, etc.? How is this going to be adapted? So this is not just about far Rockaways. This is about the wealthiest of the world economies. But the science side has had trouble trying to, let's say, conceive of solutions. I mean, Caracas was a good example. We were in Caracas with Urban Design Studio a while ago now. Because of the seismic activity, which is serious, there was the notion that Caracas should be moved, coming out of the science side. Well, nobody could do anything with that, including the mayor, who got kind of pissed off about this suggestion. Said, well, I could sell my house, but I can't move my city. So the adaptation question is huge, of course, with no answers, no easy answers whatsoever. And on the stress side, we get to that question of no easy answers. New York, to its credit, this was what, 2007, yes, there was the What If New York City competition. This projected a Category 3 hurricane with about 600,000 to 700,000 refugees who would have to be housed. This is right after Katrina. And to New York City's credit, yes, they admitted this could be a problem, which was not admitted previously in any kind of public way. It was an architectural competition. I was actually on the jury. In fact, the urban design team, one of the student team had one of the winning entries. Nothing to do with me. But I was kind of shocked because I think there were 117 entries. I don't quite remember. But there were no architects. It was really students and people in the cracks, you know, and this sort of thing. So I became pretty disillusioned about where the design professions would be going with this. And in fact, there hasn't been another competition. In fact, this was the UD students' very interesting scheme with these modules that would be temporarily placed in the streets. Of course, New York didn't want to lose 700,000 people the way New Orleans lost a huge population because they simply couldn't stay. There was no place. So there was this economic incentive that was huge. So after Sandy, I called David Burney, who was one of the organizers, at DDC, and I said, well, what happened to the what if thing? He said, well, we're trying to get a prototype built, and then this did come out in the Times a little bit later, but this is 5 years later. One prototype. The implications for fabric and culture are huge. I mean, right after Katrina, another group, I talk about urban design students because that's what I'm involved in a lot. They took a look at the FEMA trailer configurations that were going into New Orleans. Here's some of them. The fabric implications are huge because, of course, these are going to remain. So the transformative effect of temporary is huge. So that's another point I would make. I'll go fast. Here's, okay. Sandy was category 1 at best. Recovery, well, it should really be all about the next one, which is not what we're really culturally accustomed to in terms of our thought processes. It's not about just putting back. There's the forbidden topic of retreat, of course, which nobody really wants to talk about, at least very openly. As I said, we have the discussion of a 5-year repetition. So what do you do? And housing is key. There were apparently at least 60,000 displaced by Sandy, and probably more. It's hard to know. Maybe somebody has a better figure, but that was what was floating around at the time. But in the end, housing is the bottom line. I mean, that is the fabric that has to be accounted for. And along those lines, it comes down to the haves and have-nots. It's all about economics. And the economics are a difficult question in of themselves. On the left, you see some diagrams from that Rome conference and Levin Dakota's work on what he calls the capsular civilization. But there's a direct correlation between global melt and, of course, a new global spatial order, which he calls capsular. So here's another stress point, of course, and one which is not openly discussed and should be, of course, except by people like Dakota, who's, philosopher, basically. But it's being looked at heavily by DARPA, for example, behind closed doors, which is Department of Defense. I mean, the potential for global disorder around climate is huge. So that's another whole area for discussion. There's a confluence already between risk and poverty. And these are all clippings, so I just started taking stuff out of the paper because it was pretty interesting. You know, you have this surge of actual thought, and then it kind of tapers off, which it's done. But the NYCHA, of course, is the bottom line. New York City Housing Authority, those projects, many of them went in the most risk-prone places in the first place. When you had a history of the city where you have the swamps and the lowlands where, of course, you didn't build the elite housing to begin with, and then, of course, one thing leads to another, and then you have eventually the NYCHA projects, which are a huge piece of the fabric of the city, as you probably know. So I would say, as a metric, what happens to NYCHA is going to be very, very important in the next period. Okay, I think another point. Wealth will try to beat the system, the climate system, and profit from it. And if you look in some of the real estate journals, there's that one called Ashkenazi, I think, something like that. I just saw something a week or two ago about the enormous opportunities in terms of rebuilding for the real estate industry. The question is, where is that going to be directed? And we're probably pretty predictable where that's going to go. Of course, there's also the whole question of rebuilding things like the Hudson Yards and the inordinate amount of resources that will have to go into that to protect it. The new 7 line, for the first time, will have a direct water link between Long Island Sound and the Hudson. They tried to stop one of the tunnels with this plug, but it didn't really work. It lasted about 20 minutes. So there's some engineering still to be done. It will not be cheap. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that's where a lot of the money's going to go. So, I don't know, business as usual, uncertainty. I think, yes, there's uncertainty for all but the insurance industry. And remember, we're a fire economy. Fire insurance, real estate. That's been the 20th century reinvention of New York. It's going to be insurance that determines a huge amount in this whole reformulation. And whether they're going to be able to insure properties in either Far Rockaway or even Hudson Yards at an affordable risk is a big, big question. What we really need, of course, is a new Manhattan project, but not just Lower Manhattan, which of course this depicts, but for the entire city. And I do think that the questions are so profound that really there will have to be, hopefully not any later, a very coherent and expensive approach to this whole question. So, one more minute. Can we just run this? This I was very interested in. Students, UD students in the summer, they do. Can we run this? It's a tiny little video that I told them to edit heavily today. So this has to do with the Alfred Smith houses in the Lower East Side. This is last summer, pre-Sandy, but it's kind of very timely. Do I do this or somebody? Yeah. It captures something about the enormity of the adaptation problem. I don't even think you can call it adaptation. It's something else, which is something we can put on the table as well. But let's just take a look at that.
Thank you, Richard. Mindy.
Aren't you glad you have a psychiatrist next? So, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, and I work as a social psychiatrist. So this is basically a research field, and what we do is look at the connections between social structure and mental health. However, I came to research from a background as a clinical psychiatrist, working in family therapy and community therapy. I've worked in quite a number of community mental health centers before I got involved in research. So the clinical impulse is very strong. So I love to go out and hang out with community groups. Anybody has a boat ride, I invite myself along and offer tons of free advice. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I've come across. I became very interested in the problem of displacement because displacement was closely linked to the AIDS epidemic, which is what I was studying. And one of the things that was important was that I started to study whole neighborhoods that had been bulldozed. And I used urban renewal in the 50s and 60s as a kind of a model, as a case study of what I thought this was about. And what really became clear in the process of this was that it wasn't just about whatever individuals were going through, but that you had to look at these massive displacements at multiple levels of scale. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about this concept of mental health at these multiple levels of scale. And I think it's really fundamental to thinking about how do we get out of this very stuck position that we're in? How do we move out of denial? And what are the things that not just individuals, but whole groups of people are feeling at a time like this? Can I move this and it'll work? Yes. So in thinking about mental health after disaster, just want to think about who is affected, how, why, and what is to be done. The simple knee-jerk response to a disaster is that some people had some terrible experiences and they have post-traumatic stress disorder or another disaster-related illness. And of all the disasters that we've seen, I think Superstorm Sandy, we like to call it Frankenstorm in New Jersey, where I live. Sandy is really, because remember it was like a nor'easter and a hurricane, so hence Frankenstorm, which I thought was a really good title. Sandy really defies that kind of simplistic. To some extent that worked after 9/11, but Sandy completely defies that kind of model, that there are some people that you have to treat. And in fact, we have become convinced after 9/11 that to think that there was a them and a there was really rather useless, and that the point is to understand that it's all we and it's all here. Wherever it happens, it's we and it's here. But Superstorm Sandy really brings this home. So what is that about? So this is the famous picture from Union Beach, which is on the Raritan Bay. I was visiting with some seashore scientists, and I happened to get a call from Huffington Post Live, which does web shows. And they wanted to know if I would be on their show talking about 2 different college campuses that had had shootings that day. So I was deep in conversation with these people negotiating this Huffington Post Live thing, and it's kind of jarring to hear that there have been 2 shootings on different college campuses. And I've done a lot of research on violence, and I know about school shootings. So I was negotiating that. I wasn't really paying attention to Union Beach. We drove up, we parked, I got out of the car and I looked, and that's what I saw. At which point a truck drove by and a guy screamed at us, "Go back home." But there are some moments, and of course as a psychiatrist and trained as a clinician, I really try to track that kind of like gut response. That was a moment of hearing about the school shootings and the guy screaming at us and looking at that house where I thought, okay, I really get the scope of this. And that's what I think is so important. So not only is this big, but then there's a sort of classical sense that disasters unfold in a place. This is a huge place, really from Cape May all the way out to Long Island and up to Connecticut. So it's a huge terrain that's profoundly affected. They also unfold over time. So the disaster itself unfolds over a very long period of time. And the classic phases are crisis, honeymoon, disillusionment, and reintegration. But what Richard said is so important, that this is going to be really shaped by the fact that reintegration hinges on knowing how to make the repair. And if we can't put our arms around how to make the repair, we can't get out of any of this. And this is actually something that I saw in a number of cities that had been affected by urban renewal, where neighborhoods went into 30 years of limbo because of misapplied urban renewal policy, and what this was like for people, just to be in limbo in their housing. So housing as this fundamental fabric of community life, and what it was like to be in limbo for a 30-year period. So that's really how I interpret what Richard is trying to say, that these classic 4 phases are going to be distorted by the amount of time we spend in limbo. How do we help people think? How do we help ourselves think about what do we do while we make decisions? It's a little bit like when you go to a party and dinner's not going to be served till 9 and you get there at 6. What do you do with your guests? Well, you have to have hors d'oeuvres. So we've got to be thinking hors d'oeuvres. The second thing is that disaster falls on a particular kind of social organization. And in the United States, the kind of organization that exists is what Tom Hanchett has called sorting out of the city by race and by class. So in this segregated city, the social systems are highly fragmented. And this is from work by Lourdes Hernandez Cordero, who worked on 9/11 response in New York City. And those pieces are not in good communication with each other. Definitely what happens to the most vulnerable is the telling point of the whole system, as Richard said. The metric is what happens to New York City public housing. But there are 2 points that I want to make about this. The first is that as a social psychiatrist, the fundamental thesis of my discipline is that social integration, meaning social connectedness, is the true foundation of health. And that in disintegrated communities, where people are not connected to each other, rates of mental illness are perforce higher than in integrated communities. It matters not if you're rich or poor. The rich in a disintegrated society will have worse health than the poor in an integrated society. An astounding proposition that has really stood the test of time in my discipline. So disaster falls on the fragments, and the fragments are characterized not only by disconnection from each other, but by an inability to recognize threat and opportunity and to respond in a timely manner. And this is profoundly what Richard is describing as we face global warming, that we as a society are too fractured to make an appropriate diagnosis and to react in an appropriate manner. So this fundamental brokenness of the system is also part of our paralysis. I happened to meet some psychiatrists from a city in Netherlands called Enschede, which had a terrible explosion in May 2000. There were some old factories, post-industrial city in the western part of the Netherlands, old factories that were being used for a variety of uses, including storing fireworks. And some of the fireworks got lit somehow and blew up the center of the city. 12,000 people were displaced, a whole bunch 1,200 were displaced for a very long period of time. More than 100 people were killed. It was a small city of very dramatic, very important disaster. But you can see in 2007, so 7 years later, the Rombeck, which is the name of this neighborhood, is rebuilt. And not only is it rebuilt, it's rebuilt as a sort of post-industrial city, but the poor and the immigrants who used to live in Rombeck are not excluded. They're part of thinking through how the neighborhood gets rebuilt. They're part of who comes back to live there. And so the town rebuilds with the help of the nation in 7 years, but with everybody participating. The reason the psychiatrists were telling me this story is that the psychiatrists were an important part of it. And I think this is, from the perspective of social psychiatry, absolutely fundamental story, which is that it's essential in these kinds of problems to work at 2 levels of scale from a mental health perspective. It is essential to work at the interorganizational level of scale, and this is an even deeper and more urgent problem in the United States, where we basically live in a disintegrated society. There is certainly social fracture in Enschede, but nowhere near the kind of social fracture that we have in the United States. They did many tasks that involved helping all the organizations in the city to cooperate, to ensure inclusivity in the rebuilding, to make sure that the whole city did mourning and celebrating together. And most importantly, they kept everybody together on the path. So getting through the phase of disillusionment is very difficult. That's the very centripetal part of the process. People start fighting with each other, people make lawsuits, everybody's at everybody else's throats, the media goes away, the attention goes away, and the victims feel abandoned. So getting the whole, shepherding everybody, like we're in this together, we're not done, through that difficult period was a profound and beautiful piece of work. In the midst of this, they also did the kind of classic individual work. But this is the psychiatrists in the city of Enschede and the mental health professionals who are doing both these pieces of work, not just the part that we assume that they're going to treat the post-traumatic stress disorder, but both the post-traumatic stress disorder and keeping the agencies in connection. It's important to think, so, what are some of the kinds of things that you're tackling when you're keeping agencies in disconnection? On my left, there's a poster which says, since the disaster, my knight doesn't take his armor off. This is a kind of humorous campaign that goes on in Holland where they make jokes about things to get people moving. And this was just to help people realize that it would be okay to talk about their feelings post the disasters. There are many other parts of this. They wrote a magazine because as the press was drifting away, it was important to keep the story of the rebuilding before the public. There were many public envisioning sessions that everybody was invited to. So it was a very, very, very active process, humorous where possible, tender where necessary. School kids made art. Everybody did all kinds of things to help get the city out of trouble and on its feet again. So in my work on urban renewal, I thought that it was important to name this shattering of the collective that happens in disasters, in mass dispersals, in displacement. And I came up with the name root shock, which everybody who gardens will know is a term from gardening. If you rudely pull a plant out of the ground, you'll tear all the tender root hairs, you'll tear some of the larger parts of the root, and the plant will literally go into shock. They become very droopy and sad and can die. So when you want to transplant a plant, you have to work very, very, very carefully with real knowledge of the form of the roots. Plants that have a very, very deep taproot, some trees have a very, very deep single taproot. You can't move them because you can't get down deep enough. Well, I think bolder gardeners than I am would say you can move anything as long as you have a big enough piece of equipment. I defined root shock for human communities as the traumatic stress reaction to the loss of all or part of one's emotional ecosystem. An artist named Michelle Posada made this cartoon from one of my first essays on root shock. And I thought it was quite profound the way she showed the tree knocked down. In urban renewal in the United States, there were 2,500 urban renewal projects, and 2/3 of those who were displaced were African American, and so I simply estimated there's not any better marker of this, so I estimated that about 2/3 of the projects had been carried out in African American neighborhoods. That's 1,600 projects. They carried out urban renewal in 1,000 American cities. So whole huge areas of cities, like 100 acres, were leveled and the populations dispersed. For African Americans, this meant moving to other African American neighborhoods in the same or in another city. With the loss of all of this fundamental fabric of social connection, of integration, which was very strong in those neighborhoods at that time, and the loss of all the invisible kinds of things that happen between people, what commonly gets grouped together under the rubric of social capital. The being able to go to your neighbor and borrow a cup of sugar, knowing that your neighbor will take care of your kids if you have to run out to the store, knowing that your neighbor will knock on the door if she hasn't seen you for a couple of days and take care of you. That is destroyed by these processes. She made this cartoon about my friend David Jenkins, who was part of urban renewal in Southeast Philadelphia at age 11, and who said, "Losing my home and moving place to place has made it hard to trust people or feel settled." So how does this concept, I think this concept relates directly to the heart of what we're going through now, which is that, I sort of want to speak a little bit to the lived experience in New Jersey. We were hit very hard by Tropical Storm Irene. Then there was a snowstorm, the kind of Halloween snowstorm in October 2011. And then we had Superstorm Sandy this year. So for us, it's been 3 really hard storms. And New Jersey doesn't get hit by hurricanes. The hurricanes go to the left, go to the right, and New Jersey is to the left. So we really live rather peaceably without hurricanes. So the idea that a hurricane, that the Frankenstorm, was going to come up the coast and then make a sharp left right into our state was a profound and really terrifying idea. Why? Because the rules changed. Because part of what we know about place is that places are governed by rules, and part of the rules are about the weather. So here, this was the third and most massive violation of all rules about weather. So all of you have probably or possibly heard of the show Jersey Shore. If not, some of you are from New Jersey, as I am, and have been down the shore. But the shore is, it is important to say, a mythic place in the deepest sense of myth, but it is also the soul of the state. Very disconnected state, many different small parts. Everybody goes down the shore. And so to have the heart and soul of the state wiped out has been this profoundly, it is in fact, oh, sorry, I did something terrible. Can you turn it back on? Is it big? Is it big? It is in fact the loss of all or part of our emotional ecosystem. I don't know what I did. There we go. Thank you. Appreciate it. And the reason that Governor Christie has really been such an effective advocate in this instance is because his family has vacationed for generations on the shore, and he knows in his gut what everybody else in New Jersey knows in their gut, how important this was. He's not just fighting some benign battle for other people, he's fighting for his own heritage in this instance. It is this that why I say that Superstorm Sandy is different from all other disasters. That after 9/11, the rules changed about tall buildings. Prior to 9/11, people believed that if you built a tall building in the bedrock of Manhattan, it would stay up. After 9/11, the rule changed. And the rule became, if you build a tall building in the bedrock of Manhattan, it'll stay up most of the time. That's a profound shift in one's cognitive understanding of place. But this shift after Superstorm Sandy is much bigger. And that is what Richard is talking about, that we have been brought to our knees by weather that we have never seen before. We never saw a hurricane take a left-hand turn into New Jersey and wipe out our shore. And so the predictions are one thing, but the lived experience is another. We still don't have full train service. And so all of this whole catastrophe, the gut-wrenching experience of being at the shore and seeing it not what it was. Having the hurricane scientist explain that the water went over 20-foot high seawalls because the water surged up and went over the seawalls. This is beyond my comprehension. It's beyond anyone's comprehension. The point is, it's inescapable that our old way of life has vanished. And what that means diagnostically, to me as a social psychiatrist, to me as a psychiatrist, is that we are collectively in profound regional root shock. Our region cannot go back to functioning the way it was. Now, we may stay in limbo for a very long time, which is what Richard is fearing, because we are a fractured and segregated place, paralyzed to actually have a useful conversation. But we know that the past is the past, and it's now a new day. This is the boardwalk at Asbury Park, a particularly favorite place of mine. I just want to point out that they weren't quite sure what to do about the annual lighting of the Christmas lights that you can see in the convention center. But they decided to go ahead with that, and they hung the lights, and 700 people came. Because anything that that signals how we get out of paralysis, how we walk together, how we celebrate, how we keep going, is essential to human life. We are now in this strange paradox that the old life doesn't exist anymore. The new way of life has to be invented by a conversation we are almost incapable of having, and yet we have to go forward day by day. So what does one do about this? What do people do? And in particular, what does the design profession do to help? How can you help people? Hilary mentioned that I'm a public director on the National Board of the American Institute of Architects, something that sort of arrived out of the blue. It's a quite fascinating thing. But I like this role that I have because I think that the design professions are actually critically important. We have to redesign the thing. It's got to be rethought. And it's got to be rethought through as inclusive a conversation as possible. And therefore, it's the architects, it's the urban designers, it's the landscape architects, it's the graphic designers, it's all the design professions who are at a quite remarkable point, kind of the point of a plow, an icebreaker. It's you who are the icebreaker, who could, if you would, help us see it, convene the conversation, and lead the conversation. You know more about this than anybody else. And you know how to lead conversations, and you know how to help people build consensus. What I want you to know as you try to do this is that people are in deep, profound, searing agony because they have lost the world as they knew it, and it's not coming back. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks to the organizers. It's really exciting and scary to speak after Richard and Mindy, although I think it's okay because they covered most of the important things. And now you all can imagine, I guess, sitting here hearing what we've all just heard and then getting a job in a planning office as an urban designer in a city that hasn't had one before. So what I thought I could do that is hopefully helpful or useful in some way, even if useful to bat down, is to share a little bit of some small and quite modest projects. There's going to have to be a lot of them if they're going to make any difference, that we've been doing in Newark that I hope respond in some small way to some of the bigger questions that have been put out here. So first, who am I? I'm the chief urban designer for the city of Newark. In practical terms, that means about half of my job is dealing with the legal, regulatory process around buildings. If you want to build something in Newark, you'll end up talking to me or one of my colleagues. And if you have a problem with something that someone is building in Newark, you'll end up talking to me or one of my colleagues. So that's about half of the work, and that's really what you could say we get paid for. That's what drives the development process in the city. But tonight I'm going to talk to you about some other things that we do, which is about the other half of my job, which is building the things that the public builds. So I have to say, I'm certainly not qualified at all to talk about the biggest issues of climate change. Really, when I talk about public works, we're talking about quite modest things, but we're talking about the way that things really touch the ground. Some of my friends get to work in Congress, and if they win, at the end of the day, there's $60 billion, right, for some kind of restoration, we hope, in the tri-state area. And I don't get ever $60 billion, but at least I have some kind of control and some role in the decision about how that money actually takes physical shape, like what we make out of it, what the materials are, where exactly it hits the ground. I'll leave it to policy people to talk about that it's a good idea to have 1 million trees. You know, my work is much more concerned with where exactly they go. So one way that I've tried to think about some of this work is building infrastructure, making infrastructure that has roots in organized communities. As someone who teaches a little bit, I couldn't, of course, help but think back with all of the differences still to, in some ways, what I saw as the teachable moment back in the 90s when Katrina happened. That talked, I think, a lot about what Mindy just described in terms of disintegration, segregation in society, where for a moment it seemed absolutely clear that the way that we as humans make decisions about the way we lay out the places that we live reflects a lot about power and reflects a lot of different hierarchies of vulnerability. You know, and that's something also that you see when you're at the bottom end of the $60 billion, is how those resources play themselves out across hierarchies of vulnerability. But I'm going to talk about Newark. Who's been to Newark? Besides the airport? Some people? Okay, good. So, you know, Newark is basically, you know, if you know where Brooklyn is, it's kind of the mirrored, you know, mirror command over on the Jersey side, about 12 miles from Manhattan. We're a small city, 24 square miles, but the largest by population in the most densely populated state in the country, New Jersey. And our built infrastructure reflects a lot of the histories that you've already heard about from Richard and Mindy. So here's just one thing, which is tree canopy coverage in Essex County. I don't think I need to describe it. I'll let you read through some of these statistics from the census. They tell different but certainly related stories. And the last time I saw Mindy in the city of Newark, she gave me a map to add to my collection of Newark maps. Some of you might recognize the colors here. This is a map produced by a federal agency called HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that operated in response to the Great Depression. This was a map that showed basically investor risk as determined by the map makers and the people that they consulted in the real estate industry. Newark is over to your right. You see part of it is actually not even classified, and then it becomes red, which is the worst. And then as you go further out into the county, you basically see this played out in a different way. And so this reminded me of a lot of the work that I get engaged in Newark. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So if you don't know much about Newark from an urbanist or an architectural perspective, I'm not going to tell you even a little bit of what there is to know, but I'll tell you one thing. If you look at the history of Newark, you'll see the history of two very strong and very conflicting forces. On one hand, you have a map here. This is not even a complete map of urban renewal areas. I'm so glad that Mindy did, I think, a really direct job of describing that process. So these were areas that were mostly cleared in the central city of Newark, of course, as the answer of the elite to what ails the city. But over and against that force in the city of Newark, you've always had communities organizing for their say about how to make and how to remake the built environment. So this is a placard from the 1970 mayoral election, which resulted in the first elected African-American mayor of a major East Coast city. And if you go through the history, even through the architecture, these two forces are battling it out. Different names, different places, but I think some pretty consistent storylines. These storylines produce some interesting architectural history that, again, I'm still learning about, but just so you know, after the election of Ken Gibson in 1970, there was a tremendous interest in creating a new African-American Afrocentric architecture. So this is one project called Kawaida Towers. This project ended in a series of violent disputes between Italian-American residents of Newark and the backers of the project. And if you look at Newark today from an aerial view, even in the block-by-block structure, you'll see the results of some of these conflicts, some of these debates about how to build a city, how to make a city what it should be. And if you look at the ground level, I think you'll see, of course, articulated differently some of the same kinds of disjunctions. This is inside a Victor Gruen master-planned office complex that connects directly by SkyTube to the train station. It's kind of like a haiku by the elite about Newark, which is Newark, One stop to New York, one stop to the airport. Newark is good because you can escape quickly. And so for me, one of the questions that I have to answer in all kinds of small ways in my job is, well, who is Newark for, right? If we're here in the planning office to try to hold together this fragile system that was fought for 100 years ago that said people other than the property owner should have some kind of say about what gets built on the property, right? The planning boards, all these things that we as architects sometimes are not so happy about. Who is the public of Newark? And so a lyric that I think a lot about by a MC named Malice from the Clips from Virginia Beach has this line where he says, "I'm the reason your block is vacant," which for me is this amazing notion about how people narrate the stories behind the built environments they live in, right? So in the song, he's being like a big, bad, criminal, devious criminal, and his boast is that it's not white flight, it's not disinvestment, it's not the federal investment in highways that made your block vacant and disinvested, it's him. And in downtown Newark, a couple months ago, there was an ad campaign by a local business boosters group that was called Downtown Newark, It's Yours to Rediscover. And so I wonder a lot about the relationship between this kind of seizing of agency, I'm the reason your block is vacant, and the implied you in the Downtown Newark, It's Yours to Rediscover, especially if you know that the place where these signs are hung is, I think easily said, the busiest intersection in the entire state of New Jersey, right? So you have to read between the lines and say the you that is invited to rediscover is certainly not the you or the 30 to 50,000 yous that pass through and hang out and buy things and buy school clothes. And so for me, this goes a lot back to like stories that I feel like I was told growing up about American cities. And it points out, I think, some of their deficiencies. So you guys probably heard similar stories. It's like American city, circa 1900, golden age. Fast forward another 50 years, urban crisis. And of course, Newark plays an iconic role, even beyond its physicality in that. And then, fast forward another 50 years, urban renaissance, right? This is kind of like, it was looking bad for a while, but like, thank goodness, like, we got that nice apartment on the Upper West Side. And so for me, a lot of this history, and what I only realize, I think now, approaching my, in my late 30s, is that it really talks about something by its silence, which is the Great Migration, right? At least the waves of Great Migration that brought African Americans up from the South into northern cities, permanently changing the culture, the look, the life in northern cities. And it makes me realize that the discipline that I belong to, architecture, design, maybe I belong to planning in some way now, has really failed to think about those changes that happened in so many different cities in so many different ways as anything other than a trauma, right? And until we find a way to think about this thing as other than something that's just bad that happened, or something that's a loss of that golden age, then I think that it's going to be hard to design stuff that works in the long term. So what in the world does it mean to make something work in the long term when you're trying to design a city? So for me, again, it goes back to how do we weave new relationships with infrastructure, relationships between infrastructure, the built environment, and organized communities. So sometimes it just means trying to map something out. So we just launched last year the first recycling process in Newark City Hall. And so my job, again, modest role, I'm not the mayor or anything, is to make this diagram that shows, well, it's not just about being kind of a feel-goody Park Slope person. If you pour or throw your plastic bottle in one can, it goes in a truck, it goes about a mile away, and the city pays to have it burned. Or if you throw it in the other can, it goes about a mile away, all within the city of Newark, and the city gets paid. And there it is in our cafeteria in City Hall. Another example of that, if people have dealt with the NSP program, Neighborhood Stabilization Program, certainly not maybe working as well as we'd want it to, but one of the major federal responses to foreclosure and abandonment in the wake of the fiscal crisis. This was simply a project, a banner that hung on a building that was going to be taken down and made into a recreational space as part of a broader community effort funded through NSP. And so just trying to make those flows of capital, those basic keeping the lights on functions, one would like to think, of a public sector visible. The National Endowment for the Arts last year funded us to make an exhibition about who makes decisions in Newark about building. One of the things in the exhibition we thought it would maybe be a draw, at least for the architecture nerds, is a scale model. We think the first one ever built of the entire city of Newark. The way it worked is that we did a whole series, about 30 workshops that were hosted in people's houses where they could have their neighbors over to paint the buildings in their neighborhood. That's Northern State Penitentiary right there, located in the city of Newark. The buildings are color-coded by their use. And then we had about 50, so about 300 residents painted the buildings, and then we had about 50 really seriously hardcore NJIT students assemble the model over spring break. And now we're getting ready to install it in City Hall. You can come to the opening. I think it'll be in June. And so all of these things are really just trying to find ways to make the city speak, to make the city be a subject of discussion, a subject of inclusive discussion that hopefully, in the last couple of examples that I'll share, begin to actually change the shape, the feel, the look of the city. So we started a public art program about 4 years ago. We found some money that had been hidden in the budget. We started what could be accused of being the most predictable type of public art program, which is big outdoor paintings. But the thing that we really tried to focus on, rather than getting into the world of, oh, should we fund time-based art instead of object-based art and things like that, which are interesting discussions in their own right, is really the stacking, the building, the weaving of relationships behind these projects. So each of the projects that we do has a community-based organization that applies and says, tries to convince us that putting a public art project in a certain place is going to help advance their agenda for improving their neighborhood. So this mural in particular sits, I don't have a good aerial of it, between a public housing development of about 2,000 apartments and a public recreation center. Up until very recently, your only choice from going from one to the other was either to walk along an active cargo rail or go underneath this tangle of railroads and elevated highways, which is a hairpin turn for these 18-wheelers that service Sims Metal Management, a big metal recycling company right there. And so this organization had fought for a long time and had gotten a sidewalk and some lights installed. And they said that they thought putting a mural there that came from a community process would really seal the deal. So this is a project called The Cut, and that's just a kind of quick picture about how we run these. We've done about 25 so far. And so now let's talk about green infrastructure, right? We can't go a whole night talking about storms without green infrastructure. Even though New York City has done an absolutely amazing job over the last couple of decades of these green streets programs, people know that. They like dig up the triangles and they put plants there, little signs that say green streets. People have seen these? Yes, yes. So that doesn't exist in Newark, and so we thought it would just be a really good idea to steal. And so what we started doing is, just like we do with the murals, asking for applications from community-based organizations. Literally, I only have about $400,000 to do this right now. And we find those organizations and we sit down and we do some really super basic kind of design activities. So this is one that we're working on called Badger Triangle, poetic name for a not very poetic triangle. It's in the South Ward on Clinton Avenue. It's used as like a starting place for racing cars, I'm told. And so this is simply an exercise where people get to cut out things and give us reasons why I say the benches should be in a certain area or facing a certain way. And people can say, oh, well, there's old guys who always drag out their own chairs and play cards there during the summer. They sit on that side of the street because it's better for the sun or this or that. And it allows us, as we go towards actually making a hardline design, we can understand how it can be useful in addition to serving this bigger abstract concern of wanting to absorb stormwater into the earth so it doesn't overflow into the rivers. And then the last that I'll share with you is a project about South Orange Avenue. It leads out to Mindy's part of the world, part of Jersey. And in its essence, this is just a project, pretty basic, what they call a streetscape project, right? Redo sidewalks, benches, street furniture, etc. So you do small things, right, to try to get the water to go into the earth. You fight with the traffic engineers to say why a 4x8 tree pit, if it can be accommodated in the sidewalk, is perhaps preferable to a 4x4 tree pit. But on top of all that stuff, we had the chance to work with a group of young people who were doing a summer camp on South Orange Avenue and a nearby senior center. And the activities were basic architecture studio activities, walking around, making drawings, talking to people, trying to understand the site, document things that caught our eye. And originally this was just going to be a series of banners, of vinyl banners that went up and down the street upon the completion of the streetscape. Now that they've gone forward, people have gotten excited about them, and so they're also going to be the source material for doing some mosaic planters, so where we can't put a tree in the ground. These are humongous 4x4 concrete planters that weigh 2,000 pounds, that instead of just being bare concrete will now have something of the story of South Orange Avenue on their surface. And I think to conclude, let me skip through a couple things. I want to show you just about a minute of a video because while all these things, like I said, are super small, you know, they really aim at making differences to the way that we understand and tell stories about the places where we live. You know, just in the way that when you work in a city, you begin to understand how even the most abstract sounding inequities, whether they be around income or other kinds of demographics, how they really do manifest in the most basic material. Just this morning, I was in a quite tense project progress meeting about the streetscape where it was literally told to me by the contractor that the concrete was sloppy because these 12 and 13-year-olds across the street were really spooking the contractors. So you really begin to understand how these histories just don't manifest in the abstract or in the history book. They really come out, they sweat out through the pores of the city. You know, the goal has really been, how can we begin to put some other stories in there? You know, and it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of work to work them in to the degree of complication that these other stories that I think have proved inadequate. And so what this video is a super funny and mostly made up, as many stories are on the nightly news. But it's a story about some young people that I got to work with around Newark's riverfront. And the thing that I like about this, the thing that I think is a small indication of success, is the way that the story is told. So I'll just let it be told. Whoops. Oh, they're doing it there?
Around New Jersey, around the clock. This is News 12 New Jersey.
Well, you may have heard about a plan to spruce up the Passaic River area in Newark.
But the dreaming goes far beyond cleaning up a blighted area. As News 12 New Jersey's Rick Holmes shows us, the new vision could bring hundreds of jobs and even several new building projects to the Brick City.
So you started this back in October, you guys? Wow.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm seeing all this trash out here. You weren't cleaning up the trash?
No. It was not a job.
It's a mess out here. The work began with a group of Newark teens who wanted to learn more about their hometown river.
You can stop it.
Do you have to walk the river?
You have to walk.
Let me just switch it back for a last image. So as we go ahead, and actually this summer we'll open up the second portion of a riverfront park. We really hope that that story, with its true enoughness, becomes the background for a whole new series of events. Like this was our first annual Walk to the Water that we had this past June, as well as a celebration with all of the fun and funny and interesting things that you can find if you know enough people in Newark. And then, y'all should come out for the second part of our park, which opens up this May or June, which will feature the first and I think only orange boardwalk in the state of New Jersey, if not the country. And the piece that I'm probably most excited about is, in terms of continuing the stories, are these signs. And so the railing around the park will contain this kind of skyline profile that begins to tell stories that one discovers as one goes through the park. And I hope those stories aren't just about how Newark was messed up and now it's better, because maybe some people with light complexions are moving there, but I hope it's certainly a much more complex and long-term and productive story than that. Thanks.
All right, I think I'll invite the speakers to the table and we'll have time for a few questions. Presentations in a way, but drive home issues that, as let's say, an architect, and I mean, I'm speaking only in what I know. So from that position, I don't work as an urban planner, although I'm certainly interested in urban issues. But I guess time and again to sort of be reminded that this is, sort of going through. Looking from Richard, what you present, this kind of global perspective and research in the hard sciences, to Mindy really sort of pointing out issues of place and perception of that and understanding of it. To Damon, I think, I really appreciate the final projects, and I think if we begin the presentation with issues of stress to end on something more optimistic, which I think ultimately at the end of the day as an architect that is our job is to be optimistic about the future. And I wonder if we could talk maybe just a little bit more, or maybe you each wanted to respond to another's presentation, but for me, I'm wondering about how much of this comes down to also representation, and as much as it does about presentation of some of these issues. I think I recently moved to New York after being away for a decade. And it's interesting to see the images that are shown from Sandy and the map and understanding of Manhattan itself, which historically has, I think even, Richard, in your book on housing, always sort of cuts off Upper Manhattan. It presents part of it, but then we see, and we've become embedded in history of New York, not just through your book, but through many other publications, that Upper Manhattan is this other kind of place, has its own set of histories that are so different maybe from the south of Manhattan, this sort of line that gets drawn. And again, I feel like we're starting to see that over and over, that it's about these certain areas and not necessarily maybe looking at Manhattan as a whole thing. And to me, that's very interesting as going back to this issue of place, and that when we think of Manhattan, we're still compartmentalizing it, and I wonder about that as we move forward, that there are, do we only look at these places and parts of Manhattan and obviously New Jersey that have been affected, or can we look at those parts that weren't, and why is that, and as a kind of image? So I wonder if if the first projects that happen are in fact mapping projects or other sort of images, that they become as much a part of moving forward.
I think the mapping is really important, and I think that part of the key to the mapping psychologically is that it show New York and New Jersey together. It's interesting in the map that you were showing, Hilary, that kind of Staten Island is foregrounded. When was Staten Island ever in the picture? Yeah. Right? So Staten Island has kind of made the map. And the reason that it has to show the whole thing, the whole big thing, is that anything that happens that gets done is going to have effects. So if New York decides to put a big dike in the bay, all the water is going to come to Newark. So people have to be looking at Newark. And if Damon invites you on a boat ride, I went on the boat ride in October, just before, was it in October, right? Just before Sandy. It was the most illuminating thing that could have happened just before Sandy, because there's so much infrastructure on that waterfront. It's absolutely incredible. So having the big picture is a true gift. So getting the right images out there is something that I think all of you are working on and thinking about, incredibly important for setting the frame, because what happens is the frame does get set in a way that advantages the advantaged and disadvantages the disadvantaged. So how do we have a big and inclusive frame? If you can make that the iconic image of Sandy, it could help the discourse for decades to come.
They need to fix that model at the Queens Museum. If people have been out to see the panorama of New York, it kind of generally indicates where Long Island and New Jersey are, but they're just painted matte black.
What more do you need?
No, this is useful. I mean, no, that's very useful. Mindy kind of psychoanalyzed my own stress over climate change, which was quite good. And Damon, cool. You should really be in charge of the so-called rebuilding. I mean, it's another kind of planning than what's undoubtedly being discussed down in boardrooms downtown. I totally agree. I mean, we're Lower Manhattan centric on this one. It's like there's nothing else to talk about except how to keep Lower Manhattan viable. And that's a big, there's a stress point right there. I mean, New York, the fire industry invested heavily in the waterfront since the industry left. And they were also pretty active in getting it to leave more than its own volition anyway, so there's a 60, 80-year history there that's now turned on its head, really. So you better believe that the discussions downtown, like downtown, are exactly what to do next, because that trajectory of investment is now under heavy, heavy stress itself. The notion of turning waterfront into condos and putting in some grass and flipping the buildings and making a buck, that whole thing is really up for grabs. And that's going to be very interesting for the city. In a city which never, the real estate historically in New York was about Central Park. It wasn't about looking at water. It was about looking at trees. And the industry was on the edge, and the port was on the edge, and all that. That changed radically, and now it's, there's where you got a big, big piece of stress right there in terms of the economy, the investments, and all that. So I agree. And that, boy, they're gonna, they got too much going on in Lower Manhattan not to get worried. Rockaways, they're just gonna try to piece that together. There won't be any real thought about it, I believe. I remember our van in Queens when they tried to build there, and this was like 20 years ago. They did build stuff. They had to keep the houses up, to put the cars underneath and all of that. That's a mess, even that strategy. That was like making normal as if it was really normal, but it wasn't, It's a fantasy life. It's very important. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
People, but I hate to say this stuff because it sounds very negative. Right. And people then think I'm
No one would ever say that, Richard.
No, I would say so. But there's reality. I mean, you can't. Somebody has to say it.
That's interesting. I mean, I think these issues of, you're talking about insurance and fire and, certainly coming on the tails of foreclosure and banking crisis and this kind of compounding interest. But to me, it seems like there are these kind of compounding effects. And I think it's why, in a way, it's to sort of end with Damon's presentation, even, the possibility of designing wayfinding systems, which are not easy necessarily, but the posters to kids surveying neighborhoods, these things are incredibly potent, I think, and that is in itself a thing that compounds, and to me that was sort of the takeaway from your presentation, and it reminds me in a way of, and obviously we're the same generation, and at least for myself, when I got out of undergrad, that projects were, you sort of did these things on your own in your apartment. It's before the internet. It's like Stephen Hall and Laurie Hawkinson are, designing kind of interior studio spaces, and it's very much, sort of you make up your own projects, and I wonder if we're going to see a new generation of that in the context of this, and to me that would seem a way that we could maybe rethink about wellness in opposition to stress, and maybe it's naive or too simplistic, but it seems to me that there are many now new opportunities for designers and architects that are graduating from school, and despite the economic situation, I don't know.
As somebody who serves on the board of the American Institute of Architects, I just want to say there isn't any reason that people have to sit in their studios and do this alone. There's all kinds of incredible ways people can collaborate. And if architecture were to step forward with a united vision about inclusivity and rebuilding and dealing with global warming, if you could lead the society, and you should lead the society.
I agree. I agree with both of you. I mean, design is a catalyst. Design is, I totally agree that we have a huge role to play in the whole of things, and we really have to step up to the plate and play it. And that has to do with also straying from conventional models, practice, thought. That's an interesting idea, that maybe things will relocalize in the design fields. I hadn't thought of that.
It certainly seems like there's enough opportunity for those things. And I mean, it's not really local. If Manhattan is always thought about globally, right? So, I don't know. So maybe there's time for just one or two questions.
Mindy, I was really struck by what you said about social integration being really, really essential for dealing with disasters, past and present, in the individual level, vision to agency level. And what you've said, what you've said, it seems like it's about designing whole buildings or urban design, it's about designing whole systems or communications that can cope with ongoing disasters which are bound to happen. And I've been doing a lot of research recently about how communities can mobilise and self-organise in the face of that kind of disaster. And with Sandy, what is really interesting is the case studies of Sandy, and it's been a lot of grassroots mobilisation, really sophisticated complex models of fluids distribution, welfare, mutual aid for people. So I'm wondering if any of you have been looking into that, or whether you think that apply Sandy is like this kind of alternate model for communication or a new way to do communication.
I think Occupy Sandy could be a game changer if they stay in the game. I mean, that's the hard thing about volunteers, right? They can see the moment and they can get in, but they went to all the most vulnerable places and they learned the story of those places. So if they stay in the game, as making sure those issues stay on the table, that would really be a game changer in the post period. But really, the best idea is Richard Plunz's idea, which is to put Damon in charge of the rebuilding, because all of the kinds of things he's bringing to the table about how you do this on the ground, those are the kinds of things of getting people in neighborhoods to think, well, where do you want the bench? Which way do you want the bench to face? We all know it's incredibly important which way the bench faces, and you got to ask people, and they know where the sun is. So, and people are scared. So to say the sea is coming and we have to do something, what do we do? And let's all talk about it together. So Damon for czar of rebuilding. And I could just say that the one thing is that I think limbo is terribly bad. So I think that people should go back home to where they live now, right away, immediately. with the understanding that over the next 5 years, we have to make a new plan. That's my personal, I don't think anybody should be left in limbo. Like, people are saying, do I rebuild or do I abandon? Rebuild, go home, but it's not going to be permanent. We have to make some larger decisions that Damon's going to lead us in making. There you have it.
Maybe one way, not to talk about that part, but something else that you said, is kind of the difference between, and this is, one of my professors used this comparison, between Doctors Without Borders, right? When you have a huge disaster, you're happy that Doctors Without Borders is there, right? But Doctors Without Borders is not going to substitute for your primary care physician. And so one question is, can Occupy Sandy become something like a system of primary care physicians? And I think that what you said is correct, about what design can do, but I just think it's really important that we remember, those of us who have been deeply indoctrinated and spent a lot of time here in Auditorium, that by the time you get to the end of that sentence, I think design means something different than it did at the beginning, right? It means something different about authority and something different about expertise. And I think I had a fever when I read it, but I'm pretty sure, didn't Michael Kimmelman write, is this correct, like a column where he was like, well, like maybe, like in the face of all this stuff, like democracy like is in the way, right? And that's certainly a position that I deeply disagree with, that maybe like with this problem, like a problem as big as this, like we need something to like go through ULURP really fast to get its seawall up, or whatever. I mean, for me, that's a deeply scary notion, right? Because as soon as, whether it's us as architects or someone as a, because it's not going to, it won't be us as architects, it'll be, an ecological services company of some sort that employs engineers around the world. As soon as that becomes the game plan, I think that some of the things that Mindy's talking about, like, get pushed to the margin, business as usual.
Except that your point is those things don't get pushed to the margin. I mean, they're never at the margin. They're the frame of everything.
Yeah, that doesn't mean they go away, for sure.
I mean, they don't go away. They become more important. If you have, I don't want to venture too far into architecture territory, but it seems to me we psychiatrists and you architects, I mean in language, in my metaphor, but it seems to me we psychiatrists and you architects think about the issues of foundation. So what if you have a bad foundation and you don't redress it in some way? Isn't the building going to fall down? It could be bad, right? That is the whole point of architecture. The buildings have to stay up. So, like the World Trade Center was tested for a little plane, but not for a big plane, and then look what happened. So, is that true?
I heard something like that.
I heard something like that. I'm just a psychiatrist, but that's what I heard. Anyway, it fell down. So, the point is, this is a bad foundation of our society, and if it's not redressed, then it's a bad foundation for the thing. This whole issue of the concrete that's shoddy because the kids are looking at you. That's going to be there. So you can move past it, but you can't move past it. Laura.
in New York
You don't start the process of moving people out. You start the process of people talking about what's the threat and what do they want to see. And maybe they decide to stay on spiders. Who knows what they're going to decide. But to say, how do you start the process of moving people skips the step in which people decide. If people look around and you show them maps and you explain things in pretty simple, straightforward ways, just as they can figure out which way the bench should face, they can figure out, okay, we have a problem with our housing, what are our options? So I think it's essential to...
the two neighborhoods right next to each other, like Central City and Broadmoor, right? Broadmoor ended up almost 100% rebuilding and, same condition as the block over. So yes, strong community, but then the next hurricane comes along and that same neighborhood.
Yeah, it's the intermediary process. Right now, people are out of their homes. They need to get back home because they're crazy. And you've got to get back home. But then the whole society, all of us together, have to say, in some orderly way, these are the issues we face. What do we do? So we have to face. We've been in collective denial. No, we've been in collective denial. We are still profoundly in collective denial. But now we're in denial and root shock. It's a miserable psychological state. We have to face our problem.
From a planning, well, so a quick thing maybe. Y'all move over there. From a planning and architecture perspective, it just reminds me of the story I heard a couple weeks back, where it was in Minneapolis. It was like a community organizer in Minneapolis, who, and everyone here has heard the buzzword, right? Smart growth, right? That some planners made up in some conference, maybe. Someone knows the real story, I'm sure. But if you're a planner, like smart growth is supposed to be the way to go, right? It's supposed to be like undeniable, good thinking. So the story was that the guy calls me up and he's like, oh yeah, this thing's going on with the light rail, da-da-da-da. Like the planners come in, like they talk to us about smart growth, like we don't, like nobody knows what he's talking about, but we're all just like really sure it's urban renewal all over again, right? Although, for those of us inside this conversation right here, those things are like antonyms, they're opposites. And unless we can think about what is a process that, rather than us coming up with like a good marketing phrase, right, even assuming that we're on the same side, that would like go out and like tell people where they should live near transportation, they shouldn't build on green fields, etc. Like how do we actually come out with a process where by the end, some significant amount of the people in the conversation are like, yeah, that's what we decided that we wanted to do.
Maps are an interesting question. I mean, we know there are maps out there that haven't been released, and of course, maps are about power, and we got $60 billion, and it's not that far-fetched to try to reconstruct what's going on. The question is, of course, basically power. That's why the Occupy thing. I mean, your question's interesting. That was very curious. And probably there'll be more of these curiosities politically and action-wise. Everybody talks, of course, about social media and the effect of that everywhere in the world. I mean, maybe this rebuilding process will get messy in a positive way. Who knows? But who would have predicted that the Occupy folks would take that trajectory, beforehand? Is what's next? But I agree that where's the continuity? It's maps is power, always has been.
I believe that a really gorgeous, iconic map of the whole thing would it's one of those things and one of those moments. It could be just blow the whole thing open in the best possible way.
And you mean that from Cape May to Connecticut?
I mean that from Cape May to Connecticut. I think it's one of those things where it's like the Nobel Prize of Design, making this map that in some simple map way says it all and invites us to change. I believe that could be done in a map. I'm a psychiatrist, so that's why I believe a designer could do that. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
But the other thing is just to say in closing that this is a moment of discontinuity, I think, profoundly social discontinuity. And therefore, we don't know what's going to happen next. So to say, well, if we do this, it won't make a difference, it's useless because we're predicting from past models, and we're just in a new game now. So be bold, really own what you have, because you guys collectively have the answer. So own it and do it. We desperately need you. That's no joke.
Okay. On that note, I think I'd like to thank the speakers and thank you. Thank you.